It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I guess I'm supposed to sit here.
Everybody.
Howdy. There's a Love is Blind game, by the way, if you're interested in playing. It's one of our top mobile games.
So, I talked this morning about how great a partner Netflix has been. We got into more of the technical piece of it, but there's a whole other dimension to this. And Bruce, thanks so much for taking the time to share your perspective. So, and tell me if I have this right, you're the one who really brought this whole series of how are we going to do APIs at scale? How are we going to connect our customer experience to the Netflix systems?
Yeah, I don't want to take all the credit. I mean, I kind of joined the team during sort of the beginnings of the GraphQL journey.
Yeah.
So if people don't know, it started as a studio application. And so if people don't know, Netflix has a very large studio application called content engineering, and we support that pitch to play process. And that's where sort of the graph really took hold in the beginning. Yeah. And then we sort of figured out how to adopt it more widely across Netflix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your role? What's your team? Help set the context
it's like we
here a
should
little
start
bit.
talking. We didn't even get into intros. Yeah. So my name is Bruce Wang. I lead a team called Product Platform Systems. I'm in a larger org called Consumer Engineering. So consumer engineering basically is the consumer product. It's the app, it's games, it's the discovery experience, the playback experience. However you interact with Netflix, that's basically consumer engineering org. I'm in a broader group called Consumer Server Foundation, so we're a foundational team. And I tell people we're the most platform team, not in platform. So I actually run 3 teams. One is the API team. Also run a product data systems team, which handles our product telemetry. And then a third called technology lifecycle innovation, focused on debt and shared tooling. Yeah.
You give a really cool talk. I think it's called The Unexpected Journey. Is that right?
Yeah, the unexpected journey. Yeah. The API story.
Yeah. Maybe you can give us the kind of quick version of like that journey at Netflix and how it went from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of to sum up, Netflix is a really old company, right? And we have 15 years with 5 generations of APIs, right? And it started in 2008, And so it was really about that journey of how we moved from sort of one set of APIs to the next, to the next, to the next, and obviously landed on, GraphQL, or what we call Consumer Edge. And just sort of all the lessons learned there, right? That's a very tough journey. I like to tell people, I was the 5th leader to take on a migration that ended up taking about 6.5 to 7 years. A lot of lessons learned there.
Yeah.
And what I really want to avoid is doing that again for GraphQL.
What's one of the big lessons from that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because one of the big lessons was go after the hardest customer first. And so if you know the Netflix experience, sort of the most complicated canvas we call is what we call the homepage. Right? That's when you land, call it the LOLAMO, which is list of movies. It's not that interesting of an acronym. And the previous stack, we decided to move that last. Right? We wanted to get the system working, and it took forever. And so this time around, the mobile team actually bet on LOLAMO first. And so that was a really interesting kind of, you're like, is that really a good idea? So yeah, that was one.
So you went for the most critical use case up front.
Yeah.
Is that about de-risking? Is that about really like calling the question on how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really believe in providing value. Like, I don't believe in adopting technology just because it's cool. I mean, it's cool, but it has to provide value, right? And so we need to be able to show that value quickly. Related to that, actually, you should know is that we actually didn't build the first stack. The mobile team built their own version. And so that's about kind of how do they quickly get on the platform to work out the kinks on the client side, right? So what folks may not know is that this is a pretty significant shift. We're changing the client-server data access protocol, right? So we built FileCore, and now we're moving to GraphQL. It's a big shift. And so the mobile teams had to really figure out their side of the story, and they need something to connect to. Yeah.
So I talked about bootstrapping this morning.
Yeah.
So it sounds like part of the way you went about that is you had the client side solve enough of it on their own to be able to attack their piece of the puzzle.
Right.
While you were, yeah, okay.
So by the way, I was not happy with the architecture they picked, okay, because what they did is they put a node container service that calling the previous API. I'm like, I'm trying to get rid of this. Like, what are you doing? And it's like, but we were trying to finish the previous migration, so we couldn't help with the next gen.
Yeah.
And so we were like, what are we going to do? We can't block them, and we got to enable it. So they ended up building the first prototype, and eventually we took it over. And actually, where federation came in, that became the super valuable thing is we were like, this server must go through the gateway. That's the minimum requirement, because when we put in our DGS, our Java framework based server, then we can slowly replace the queries and the types and all that stuff behind the scenes. Yeah.
How do you measure value? What's that look like from your seat?
How do I measure value? It's fascinating because when I took over the API team, we had sort of a really big challenge, right? We ran a very large monolith, and what we're trying to figure out is like, what is the next generation stack gonna solve? Like, what's the big problem that we're trying to solve here? And so when we wrote the vision for Consumer Edge, one of the things we said is like, can we write it without saying GraphQL? Like, can we write the value proposition without listing GraphQL as because that's a technical implementation. And so there's kind of two big areas that we're really trying to solve. We're trying to unify the graph or unify the APIs. So what people don't know is that in all our previous stacks, each individual UI built their own APIs. So iOS had one API, Android had another API, TV has a different API. So being able to unify across a single API was super valuable, right? Because then you get sharing. The other aspect is while we had a single API team that could kind of manage the API, we just couldn't scale to the business anymore. We were a small team. And the other side of the value is, can we empower domain owners to manage and own their own APIs? So the value was really around, what is something we actually can't do with the current architecture?
Right, and that probably leads to, we were talking yesterday about, you started with, tell me if I have this right, you started with a focus on the application side, and this was the use case.
Yeah.
More and more you're thinking in terms of the API owners, the service owners.
Yep.
And we were talking a little bit about what I was going to say this morning about marketplaces. How's that worked for you? I'm curious what that shift has felt like, or how you've approached that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so as I mentioned when we first started, it was really about value proposition on the client, right? The mobile client consuming the API. But the other side of the house was, how do we actually federate and democratize that edge, right? And so more and more we have to think about taking this pretty sophisticated monolith and breaking apart across the major domains. So we basically have like three big domains at Netflix from the consumer side. We have the growth graph, the discovery graph, and then the identity graph, right? And so it was really about figuring out, how do I empower those folks to own their API? And it's actually not easy. Something I did was like, the API team end up, and this typically happens with an API team, is we end up owning one of the domains, one of the biggest domains in Netflix, which is discovery. So we weren't just the stitching layer, we actually manifested the models and the representation of Netflix, right? So that was an example of like.
Why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, the dirty little secret.
Because the reason I ask is, a lot of people ask us, what should the roles look like, and
right.
and how much of this should I be responsible for directly, and.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to like ancient history, like early on, and this is funny because the dirty little secret of microservices, we pioneered that too. The first thing we did to solve the microservice problem was put an edge layer in front, right? Is because we had so many libraries and services, there was no single like representation of the Netflix experience. And so the API team inadvertently became the central clearinghouse of the models, right? It wasn't on purpose. It was just, oh, you want the title, you get it from here. Oh, you want the image, you get it from here. Oh, you need OC steering from the CDN, you need this other library. And slowly, as you had more and more teams come up, do specific targeted functionality, you end up creating this very massive dependency graph, right? Hundreds and hundreds of libraries to represent the Netflix experience, So that, it was accidental, and to enable the devices and the teams to go fast, they needed a central place to get that data.
So what changes now that API teams do more and more of the work of bringing things to the graph? Like how's that changed the shape of the graph or the way you do the work?
Yeah, so you were asking about value earlier, and the thing that we really wanted is for the UI team to talk to the backend team without us being in the middle. I mean, it seems really simple, right? And that's what we're starting to see, right? The design of the graphs are happening organically. The backend teams and the UI teams are working together. We're using tooling to make the sharing easier, the testing easier. New graphs are coming up without us even knowing. I mean, that's the whole point. Like, we don't even know what's coming up. We're also into games and things like that. And so you're seeing new parts of the graph spring up. Now, on the studio side, it's a beast. Like, it's probably one of the most sophisticated graphs in the world. 200 plus domain graph. I mean, that's literally like a massive graph. Yeah. Consumers are a little more organized because you have a set experience, but you're starting to see that sort of next gen of APIs being formed without having us being involved. But it's a tricky proposition because one of the principles I have is I don't want to federate the pain. API team has value, has hard-earned experience of running a very large edge. And if you just all of a sudden just give that responsibility to a bunch of backend teams that never done that, that starts becoming a problem.
What do you hold on to in that model?
Yeah, I mean, this is the tricky part for us actually, is, I still have engineers who are very involved in tuning and scaling because we're still sort of at that curve, right? We're, I don't know if I can say exact numbers, but let's say hundreds of thousands of RPS. But we need to move to millions of RPS, roughly enough. Legal should be fine with that. They don't care. And so when we're starting to move that order of magnitude, the scale becomes real challenges, right? Because also we have to run it efficiently, cost efficiently as well. And so I think it's just a matter of like, as we put on more traffic, and don't forget, with other migrations happening, right? Like other platform migration, we're moving JDK, we're moving to service mesh, things that we don't control. And so now you're kind of adding complexity to that migration. And so that's where we're trying to help guide these DGS scale.
How'd you go from, it sounds like you're now at a point where a lot of this is up and running and organic. What was that cutover point? How did you know you'd gotten there?
I would say consumer, we're not there yet. I think it's still critical. I tell people unless TV's on, like we don't have anything. So I'm like, TV is our biggest 10-foot experience. And so I still, obviously my team's very happy. We're all happy with how far we are.
Yeah.
But I don't think consumer is quite there yet. I look at studio and enterprise. So Studio eventually became the enterprise edge because we basically put an entire studio experience plus all of our internal app experiences, all of our platform experiences. And I think how we knew was just when we couldn't even track the number of experiences that was being created anymore. Like early on, you were very white glove, right? You're like, I'm trying to get one app experience onto the edge. Yeah. And at some point, every day you look at the graph, you're like, what is going on? Who is these people? Like, but it's working. You realize, okay, now we got to really work on tooling, developer experience, docs.
Yeah.
Consumer is still a little earlier in the journey because we're still filling it out.
Yeah. And how involved is your team in the schema itself? Like, what's your take on governance?
Oh, the governance story. That's good. So once again, two different stories. In the studio world, we, took an early hands-on approach, but the whole idea was that we wanted the studio teams to be empowered on their graph, right? We're not the experts, they are. The difference on the consumer is that API has held those keys for a very long time, right? They controlled the schema, or we controlled the schema. And actually, backends and UI teams didn't, we sort of decided what the API was. And so actually what we did is we took a very measured approach where before the backend teams can truly take on the next gen of the API, the discovery API, we basically built the first version of the graph, right? So we had a team who ported our Falcor APIs to GraphQL and ran effectively a mono DGS. That wasn't federated yet, right? But we were then bringing value so that the mobile teams could move on to the graph with sort of, API built GraphQL APIs.
So here's another way to think about bootstrapping. I think what I'm hearing is you built maybe kind of a first cut of what that contract should look like.
Yep.
And I remember, now that I'm putting the pieces together, a lot of Federation 2 came out of these discussions that we had in our teams about, it's not just that the schema is going to change a lot in the graph. One of the things we learned from you is the org structure underneath that's going to change, right?
Yeah.
This whole question of type and field ownership came down to the team that first defined the type or the field isn't necessarily the right long-term custodian. Now I'm putting the pieces together. So you build sort of a minimum viable, if I can use that term, schema.
Right.
And a lot of that's about bootstrapping, and a lot of that's kind of creating an overall structure or shape.
Right.
But then the teams have started to run with that maybe as a template or a guide or...
So I'll give you a very specific example. And actually the previous talk talked about know your customer, right? So early on, we actually ported, because remember, the true APIs that the UI was connecting to was built by the UI teams, not by us. We were the mid-tier API, and there was another UI API. And so we made a conscious decision for the engineers to get into the UI code and figure out, how do I port this logic into the graph? This very custom iOS, Android specific APIs into a more generally usable graph. And we learned so much. There was so much logic being done there. There was so much logic in the BFFs. And it's like, how do you represent this on the, where does this even go? Who would own this, right? And so this is where we purposefully said, hey, we're the experts. We build that first translation layer. Once we have that first cut, then what happened is when we went to the identity team, who's a sister team, Consumer Identity and Access, which is CIA, by the way. We love our acronyms. And, we worked with them to say, hey, this is your part. We own it today, but you should own it, right? And we're still working with them to figure out what that looks like. How do I decouple the first version so that you can federate it out?
Yeah. Let's talk about the people side of this.
My favorite.
Yeah. What's the Supergraph meant to other people in the org? Like how have they received it?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier how when I came in to take over the API team, and I started in Jan of 2020, and I was told, the API team is one of the best teams at Netflix and one of the hardest to lead. I was like, oh, cool. Sounds like a great challenge. And what I quickly realized is it wasn't a technical problem, right? The API problem of being that, what we call the hourglass problem of all the clients, all the backends, and you had the single choke point, and it was API. It wasn't the technology. It was the fact that earlier what I said is it's a lack of communication between orgs. Now, consumer engineering is actually a new organization. It was a combination of UI teams and backend teams merged together. But when I started, those were two separate places. So we were almost like the in-between people layer between the backends and the UIs, right? And so we had to figure out and recognize that is the role we played, right? And how do we get folks talking and working together and conveying what this API actually did, right? What's funny is we housed so much of that knowledge and experience over 15 years that literally some teams in the back were like, their only caller was us. So, and then our only caller is the UIs. So none of us really knew how each other was using the API. And so we call this like stacked layer, right? You have a backend gRPC API or REST, then you had our layer, which is Falcor, and then you had a UI layer, which is also Falcor. And so the people problem is like, okay, if we're gonna solve this collaboration problem, it's not just about get GraphQL and it will be great, right? And we purposely said, if we got GraphQL and we end up with 4 graphs, we failed. Like, that's not what we want. We want a unified experience so that the teams can work more closely together. And it was actually a challenge.
And understand each other might be a way to put it.
Yeah, I guess, maybe, yeah, understand. Oh, trust me, I mean, I don't know how many conversations we've had to try to like explain the two sides, you know? And we've really had to figure out how do we extricate ourselves from that role. And actually, I used the big hammer. I just reorged that team out and said, API doesn't know that anymore. It's now in the right domain. And that was a hard decision. I mean, it's hard to give up team members, hard to give up knowledge, but it didn't make sense for us to own a specific domain, right? And so the org thing was very like, you had to really think about more holistically. Like, what are we trying to achieve with this architecture? And ultimately, we're moving towards multi-domain. As you know, we're going multi-product. We have games, we have live, we have ads. So we have to think about enabling architecture rather than doing everything.
Right.
Yeah.
You hit on something, maybe a last topic for us. You mentioned the developer experience a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
And you've been talking about this model where more and more people can have these conversations on their own. How have you approached that? What have you found works well, or what do you invest in on that?
Yeah, so you asked earlier about schema governance, right? And how do you balance sort of the automation of tooling that makes it easier for people to share graphs versus actual people who gets folks to talk to each other and collaborate? And we sort of use a dual approach, right? We have tooling that lints the graph, we have tooling that makes it easier to share and test the graph, but then we also are trying to invest in, intentional communication patterns, like what are we learning from these different graphs? Because the thing is, with what you said earlier about the organizational challenges, like, frankly, a lot of teams, you could just be in your org. You don't have to talk to other, right. You don't have to, why do I have to talk to people? It's scary, And so like, you're forcing the conversation of like, oh, everything's on the graph now. Should growth access this discovery API? Should they implement their own? I mean, they're really having those conversations. So sometimes you're using through tooling, but sometimes you're using just good old-fashioned people and trying to nudge the conversation to happen, right? So I think the developer experience to me is a multi-pronged approach.
And another thing in there is it's a different kind of conversation when it's backed by data or backed by some actual information. And the graph brings that. Like you can see what you're talking about.
Oh yeah. Oh dude, there's been so many times where people will be like, what does this DGS do? And I just go to our experience and be like, here's what it does, and here's who calls it, and this is the schema it implements. And
right.
It sounds so basic, but like we didn't have that information in the previous APIs. It was like a black box, right? And like only API team knew how to like manipulate that black box.
Yeah.
We didn't even look at notes. Is that wrong?
I don't know. What else did you want to talk about?
It's like, you're not reading my notes. Yeah.
I actually don't know how much time we have. I don't have a clock.
Minutes. 5 minutes.
What else do you want to talk about?
I don't know.
What's next for you guys?
What's next for us?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, for me, I'll tell you kind of my personal journey, which has been interesting, is that, I started as the API leader, and I helped, to some extent, build this vision. But I've kind of moved on to work on other things at Netflix and focus on broader, more complicated projects. And so for me, it's like API is not like Miriam's got it all handled. You work with the team. Like I don't even worry about it too much anymore. And I'm really thinking about sort of some of these bigger technical challenges at Netflix. We're a very large org. How do we deal with tech debt? How do we name it? How do we finish these migrations? Because by the way, GraphQL is not the only migration we're doing, right? We're doing 3 others. And they're all massive, right? And one of my other teams, is doing the other one, which is completely re-architecting our client telemetry architecture. So that's where I'm focused on in terms of this, like, how do I think about applying these lessons learned an API and help other teams, So, sorry, is that not the answer?
No, yeah.
Should I say Fed 2? Is it? Yeah,
Fed 3.
Fed 3.
I don't think we're going to do a Fed 3. We're good on 2. Well, as I said this morning, there's no, I think, better crucible for these ideas and this technology than what you've built for so many reasons. The culture, the product you have, the scale of that product. I hope some of this is of value to folks that are going down this path. And I know it was always an aspiration for me to look at how Netflix was approaching this. And as I said, this is a chance for us to hopefully play that card again and shape things.
Yeah, and last thought, and I can't leave without saying this. I want to pierce the aura a little bit. Netflix is subject to gravity. It's subject to all the challenges you face. We have our own problems in dealing, and you might think, oh, Netflix has infinite resources. No, we don't. Trust me. I was just in planning. We do not have infinite resources. And so I just want to say, we're in this journey with everyone, right? This is moving to a whole new paradigm of thinking. It takes a lot of work, and it's not easy, and we're not immune to any of this stuff. We deal with the same problems. Yeah, maybe the RPS scale is larger, but the people problems is similar.
Yeah.
The how you design, how you facilitate, how do you, when I listened to the previous talk, I was like, yeah, literally everything she said, yeah, that we need to do that. And we did that, right? And so I just wanted to tell everyone, hey, Netflix is a great brand and I love it and it's a great company, but there's a lot of challenges we deal with, and that's why I like working there.
I mean, maybe that's the other takeaway here is a lot of what you've done here came out of the constraints you had. You couldn't double the size of your team as the number of services grew, and you had to find ways to scale.
Yep.
And that might be as good a punchline as any for this stuff, is that it can be done, and it has this efficiency gain.
Yep.
Not without its challenges and its problems, to be sure, but I think that's a remarkable story.
Yeah.
And maybe a good one to leave folks with.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
All right.
It's kind of weird talking to you. I can't even look at the audience. It's weird.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.